at its core, Bitcoin is an accounting book. Now we're going to share with you how that enables sound money. We use the book to keep track of how much money each person has. So now bear with me as we walk through an example that has been used extensively in the Bitcoin education books, but we are going to take it one step further and actually show you the accounting book directly from the node. In this episode, I'm going to show you Bitcoin so you can see it for what it is and dissolve the mystery. Welcome to the Heartbit podcast, where we delve into the heart of Bitcoin and uncover the sweet spot for enthusiasts worldwide. I'm Danny, your fellow explorer in the Bitcoin universe, and this is our technical series where every episode is about what is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an accounting book, and now we're going to share with you. Silence! Thank you. Yes. There is a lot of noise and confusion about what Bitcoin is. This show is here to silence the noise and bring you the signal. This show is for the average person who wants to understand how things work and why. This episode is dedicated to my aunt and my cousins and my friends who are lost, because I want you all to come on the boat, to be freed from the shackles of fiat money and join the insurrection. As I was saying, Bitcoin is an accounting book. Here, we're going to break things down to its core concepts, and at its core, Bitcoin is an accounting book. Now we're going to share with you how that enables sound money. We use the book to keep track of how much money each person has. So now, bear with me as we walk through an example that has been used extensively in the Bitcoin education books. In the next episode, I will show you how to run a node so you can keep a copy of the accounting book yourself and hold the power that comes with it. Imagine your group of friends is hosting a game and you need some play money. You solve it by having Alice keep a table on the computer with the names of the people and the money that corresponds to each. Instead of thinking of these as transactions, think of them as checks. Each of those lines represents a check that person received for that amount of money. In this example, Alice is just going to give each player a check for 100 when the game starts. The Bitcoin economic policy is more complex than this, and we will discuss it later, but for now, let's just assume the table starts with each person already having 100. It's simple enough at the beginning when Alice just assigns 100 to each player. But what happens when each person starts giving others a little bit here and a little bit there? It becomes really hard to track who gave what to whom and how much they have left. In addition to thinking of each line as a check, we need to think of them as potential inputs. If Alice or Ben want to spend their money, they must use their existing checks to pay. At the same time, for the person receiving the payment, the check is a potential input for their own transactions. This is known as the circular economy. Bitcoin handles this by keeping track of the checks that have not been spent. The actual table will contain every check, but here we're only going to show you which checks have not been spent. So let's see what it looks like when we start moving money one check at a time. Edgar went all in on a bet and had to pay Ben 100. That's quite simple. We mark Edgar's check as spent and add a check for Ben for 100. Since Edgar spent their check, we remove it from the list. Ben has to add up every time his name appears on the list to get the total amount of money available to him. Let's try another, more complicated transaction. Dave has a check for 100 and needs to pay Carol 20. He can't cut the check in half and give it to Carol, so how can Dave pay Carol? For now, we're going to have Alice break the check for Dave, but in reality, this process is more complex and managed by the miners. Since in Bitcoin, there is no centralized entity such as Alice to manage the table. So Dave goes to Alice and asks her to please break the check into 2 checks. So Alice gives Carol a check for 20 and gives Dave a check for 80. This is when things get interesting. we need to separate the notion of transaction from the notion of check. One transaction may involve more than one check. For example, here we took one check as input and created two checks as output, but that created a problem. In the spent to category, we couldn't write one name because it went to multiple people. Our table can reflect that strategy by just adding a couple of columns. For clarity, I will include all the checks, including the ones that have been spent. So if we read this table, we would say that Dave's check number 4 was spent in transaction 8. And if we look in the list, what checks are part of transaction 8, then we can see that checks 8 and 9 are the output of Dave's payment. Now we can remove the spent checks, leaving us with this. Ben can pay Carol $200 if he wants, but he would need to use 2 checks to add up enough money to pay her. That would be a transaction that takes 2 checks as input and produces 1 check as output, giving us this. Everything seems to be going great, but since Alice is also participating in the game, some friends express discomfort with the fact that only she has access to the list, so she decides to make it public. However, other players voiced concerns about their names being visible to everyone, so Alice decides to replace them with pseudonyms. It all seems to be resolved, except that not everyone trusts Alice, and she could unilaterally make changes to the list. Instead of having one copy that everyone can see, they opt to distribute the list so that everyone has a copy. If you've followed me so far, then you should be happy to know that this is basically it. At its core, the Bitcoin accounting book is that simple. But the measures that need to be taken so the book isn't tampered with are deeply complex. The list itself is not terribly complex, but the methods to secure it are. Okay, so now everyone has a copy, but how do we know whose is correct? We need a strategy to update the table, otherwise we will have many different versions. We need a strategy to determine the correct and the most up-to-date table. Also, when everyone has their own copy of the table, what stops them from creating money from thin air or spending one check multiple times? This is when things get a little complicated because the solution involves a series of sophisticated steps, but bear with me and I will do my best to explain them in plain English. Before I explain the exact steps, I need to explain what hashing means. Hashing is a mathematical process that can take any number as input and produce a unique output of a predetermined size. Hashing is similar to notarizing a document. In Bitcoin, the hashing functions used are SHA-256 and RIPE-MD160. These functions take in data of any size and produce as output a number that is 256 and 160 bits long, respectively. Bits just means ones and zeros, so SHA-256 will take in any size data and produce a unique sequence of 256 ones and zeros. The number of possible ways to combine 256 ones and zeros is 2 to the power of 256, larger than the number of atoms in the visible universe. That means it's practically impossible to produce the same hash with 2 different inputs. This is referred to as being collision-proof. Another important quality of hashing is that it is a one-way function, meaning that you can produce a hash from the data, but you cannot figure out what the original data was from the hash. Okay, so empowered with this knowledge, let's proceed. The first step is for the group to broadcast their transactions to everyone. But what stops Dave from pretending to be Ben and creating a transaction with Ben's money? This is when asymmetric public key cryptography comes in. Instead of using random pseudonyms, we use a public-private key pair. The next technical episode will explain what a key is in more detail, but for now, know this. It is possible to have one number that is secret from which we derive a second number that is public. In Bitcoin, we go further and create an address by hashing the public number. Because it's a one-way function, people cannot derive your private number or key from the address. The address is the pseudonym your funds are associated with, and the private key is used to prove that the pseudonym is yours. But since the private number cannot be revealed, you prove it by performing a mathematical equation that only the owner of the private number associated with the related address could perform. This ensures that when you publish a transaction, you can prove that the checks that you are using to pay actually belong to you. Bitcoin is pseudo-anonymous, meaning that if it is used correctly, the pseudonym can be so private that it is impossible to determine who is behind the moniker, and therefore anonymous. The second step is known as consensus, and is achieved through a distributed timestamp server that uses proof of work. Yes, that was a lot of jargon, and I will explain it to you now. A timestamp server is a tool to prove that a piece of data existed at a given time. This is achieved by hashing the data and publishing the hash. Why is this proof? Since only the exact piece of data could produce the given hash, if the hash exists, then the data exists. At this point, we need to return to our table and see it not as a table with infinite rows, but rather as a book with pages of limited size. In Bitcoin, we call the pages blocks, but they are no different from the pages in an accounting book. Instead of checking and revalidating the entire book after every transaction, we create a hash at the end of each page. If even a single bit in that set of transactions is changed, then it would produce an entirely different hash. That way, we only need to be on the same page, all pun intended, regarding the most recent set of transactions in the book rather than the entire history. Let's say that people have transacted enough to fill an entire page. At that moment, we generate a hash. But how do you stop someone from changing an entire page? Well, you include the hash of that page at the top of the next page, and so changing one page would require changing all subsequent pages. This is why it is known as blockchain, because every page is linked to the next through the hash that connects the previous page to the next. We use the timestamp server to agree on the order of transactions. So if someone tries to reuse a check, we will know because the timestamp server will tell us that a transaction that spends that check has already been included in an earlier page. Okay, but who produces the hash? Where is it published? Well, anyone can produce the hash, and it is stored in every computer along with the list of all the checks. The person who gets to produce the hash is the one who wins what I like to call the nonsense competition, which is no nonsense at all. It's what in Bitcoin is known as proof of work. This is why the timestamp server is distributed, because any miner can produce the hash. In order to ensure that pages are turned at a consistent rate, Bitcoin adjusts the difficulty depending on the amount of computing power competing in the nonsense competition. The way it achieves this is by demanding that the hash on the page is preceded by a certain number of zeros. The more zeros, the harder to produce the hash. A set of data will always produce the exact same hash, so in order for the hash to change, the input data has to change. For this, we need to create an additional field in our table called the nonce. Think of it as nonsense. It is a field that the miners can change arbitrarily in order to change the resulting hash until they produce one that contains the desired number of zeros. It's a game of chance, where the person who makes the largest number of guesses has the highest chance to win. I call it the nonsense competition because the person who gets to hash the page is the person who can come up with the correct nonce that will produce the desired number of preceding zeros. Okay, but if there are discrepancies in the list, how do you resolve who has the most up-to-date copy? Using power! Okay, I'm joking, but I'm not joking. In our example, it is equivalent to who has the most amount of pages. Like if you're on page 8 and I'm on page 11, then my version is the final version. I like to go back and emphasize on something that I executed trivially in the example. At the beginning of the story, Alice simply assigned 100 to each person. In the Bitcoin accounting book, the origin of money works a little differently and relates closely to important economic policies. In Bitcoin, there is a limited supply, but not all of it was put into circulation at the same time. The money is put into circulation by awarding it to the winner of the nonsense competition. We are rewarding the users for participating in the nonsense competition and creating timestamps of the pages. The amount of Bitcoin that will ever be is almost 21 million. Approximately in the year 2140, all Bitcoin will be in circulation, and the winner of the nonsense competition will only be rewarded by the fees rather than increasing the supply. This is important because by having a fixed monetary supply, it makes the currency deflationary rather than inflationary. Okay, so to recap, we kicked things off with Alice introducing her trusty table to keep track of play money among friends. Then we saw how each entry represented a check, each detailing a transfer of funds between players. As our play money economy grew, we realized the importance of tracking unspent checks to maintain transparency. Next, we delved into the world of public-private key pairs, ensuring pseudonymous transactions while maintaining security. We then explored the role of hashing, ensuring the integrity and immutability of our transaction data. With the need for a decentralized timestamp server, we introduced the concept of proof of work consensus, where miners compete to add transactions to the ledger. As our individual tables evolved, we transitioned to a distributed ledger, the blockchain, ensuring consensus among all participants. Miners entered the scene, engaging in the nonsense competition to validate transactions and secure the network. Through consensus mechanisms like the longest chain principle, we resolved discrepancies and ensured the integrity of the ledger. Along the way, we discussed Bitcoin's economic policy, emphasizing its limited supply and deflationary nature. And finally, after all these steps, we arrived at the robust and decentralized network we know as Bitcoin. I've always been really excited to look at the actual Genesis blog, where you can find hidden embedded data. So I'm going to leave you with a look into the actual file so you can ponder as you secure your funds. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like on the computer. The actual node data is not this easily accessible because it's stored in files to optimize for efficiency. I wrote a program that interprets those files and stores the information neatly into a table so we can read it easily. We've taken a deep dive into the heart of Bitcoin, breaking down its complexities into digestible pieces, from the simple analogy of an accounting book to the intricate workings of hashing and consensus mechanisms. We've explored how Bitcoin ensures security and transparency in transactions. Remember, Bitcoin isn't just digital currency, it's a revolution in financial freedom. So join us next time as we continue unraveling the mysteries of Bitcoin and guide you through running a node. Stay tuned and let's navigate this Bitcoin universe together.